Most of the time, we don't really remember things until we're about 4 or 5. The same thing applied to me. Both my parents worked, so I spent most of my time with my grandma. The town wasn't necessarily horrible, but it wasn't great at the same time. It didn't promise much safety, but it was still safe at the same time. Paradox, right? I was a pretty rambunctious kid, so I spent most of my time outside. My grandparents' front yard was the biggest part of the land, so it was practically my own playground. Since I played outside every day and every hour, anybody was able to see me. Then began the ride forward. I always saw it pass the house out of the corner of my eye, but never paid mind to it because, as a kid, I could care less. The truck would pass by about every 5 minutes and slow down as it got to the front of the house. I constantly felt like I was being watched, and in reality, I was. The first time the truck actually stopped, I heard a high-pitched whistle that caught my attention. When I looked over, I saw a man leaning over in the passenger seat and looking intently at me. The weird part about this is that I have absolutely no recollection of what he looks like. Whenever I try to think about what he looks like, all I can see is just the dark figure, basically an outline of him. Maybe I just suppressed it. Come here. Since I was a friendly 5-year-old, my mind didn't see any red flags. I walked up like the eager child I was and stood in front of the gate that stood as a barrier between us. I have a cat back in my house down the block. Do you want to see her? Before you say anything, I was taught the concept of stranger danger, but my mind just never absorbed it. In my mind, if somebody looked or sounded friendly, they were no danger to me. Excited out of my mind, I hopped the fence without a second thought while this guy opened the passenger door for me. I got in and settled in my seat, squirming around as I waited to see the cat. My impulsivity got the best of me, and I could feel the consequence of it. That eagerness began to slowly dissipate away as this sinking feeling in my stomach replaced it. While he drove off, I tried my best to look away from him, focusing on all the details outside the window. Even though I couldn't see what he was doing, I just knew that he was staring at me. I could feel his eyes scoring my body, even my heart racing as I felt violated by the touch of his gaze. At this point, my eyes were clenched tight as if I were trying to imagine being somewhere else. I think it was then that the idea of stranger danger really sat with me. Typing this part out is sending intense chills down my spine because while my eyes were closed, I felt his touch. He caressed his hand along my thigh as if I were precious cloth, and my heightened sense of hearing shivered my body to the core because I could hear his heavy, shallow breathing as if he were excited. Then I could feel a change in the atmosphere. I opened up my eyes for once and looked up to find him panicked while looking behind him. Shit, he muttered under his breath. The car began to pull over and I could tell that every muscle in his body was tense. He looked as though he were racking his brain trying to think of some sort of an idea. He placed his hand on my shoulder and there was a burning sensation replacing the feeling of his touch. Alright, Maya, just remember, you're my niece, okay? My brain didn't really catch on to what he was saying while I stared at him in confusion. I was absolutely oblivious to what was going on and just sulked in this panicked environment. A man walked up beside the driver's window, dressed up in a police officer's outfit. He looked at the man and then at me and smiled, then he asked, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Sweating like a madman, he squirmed in his seat and stayed silent. The cop then took a good look at me and smiled as he said, "Hey sweetheart, I need you to get out of the car right now." He walked over to the passenger side where I was sitting and reached in from the open window and pulled me out. I remember this huge sense of relief spreading around me, not just in my heart or stomach, but as if this immense heat that was surrounding me had been blown away. I held on to the savior of mine tightly and listened while he argued with my kidnapper. "What the heck do you think you're doing?" he yelled at the cop. The cop looked back at him with a hint of anger that he was trying to suppress and said, "You're not Sly Slick. I saw you trick this little girl into coming into your truck. I saw her enter your car and I saw you drive away. Now I'm going to bring her back home and my partner is going to cuff you up and make you regret ever thinking about kidnapping this girl." It was practically like a movie as this officer carried me back home. My grandma and parents were told what happened. There were tears at what could have been, and there was a bit of anger that I hadn't learned the concept of stranger danger, but overall, I'm freaking glad that cop had seen everything and stopped this guy before he could do anything. Here's a creepy incident that I endured some years ago. I'm a 41-year-old male, but the following events happened to me in 1999 when I was 24. It's important to mention that I had an average build and was never a tough guy per se. I was working the graveyard shift at a motel in Oregon. My job title was night auditor, as I was expected to compare the daily revenue with the figures in the computer. Occasionally, somebody would check in or out, but for the most part, I hardly saw a soul on my shift. My only other duty was to walk around the property every couple of hours to make sure there was nothing unusual going on. Checking the darkened property at night was always a bit creepy. The motel had a lot of rooms, and the large parking lot offered a great mini hiding spot for anybody who might be lurking. In my first few months, I had to chase the occasional bum off the property or out of the lobby. They always wanted shelter and free coffee, but my typical night was extremely uneventful. Nonetheless, I was nervous about being antagonized by violence-prone weirdos, so I bought a big can of pepper spray and a mag light, those big black police-style flashlights. One night at 3 a.m., I stepped outside to check the property. It was midwinter and very cold, so I wore my coat. On the opposite side of the parking lot, a large man in a green t-shirt and jeans was marching purposefully toward one of the buildings. I thought it was odd that he'd be outside in just a t-shirt since it was so cold that my face was stinging. He marched to a motel room door and tried to open it, finding it locked. I watched him intently. He marched to the next door and tried to open it. Then the next one. "Excuse me," I said, somewhat loudly. The man stopped, facing away from me, his hand still gripping a door handle. I walked toward him, gripping my mag light and pepper spray tightly. It was obvious to me that this guy was up to no good. "May I help you, sir?" I added. The guy turned around and faced me. He was nearly 6.5 feet tall, looked muscular beneath a thick layer of body fat, had big curly dark hair with a thick handlebar mustache, and, worst of all, was covered with blood. It was all over his face and the entire front of his shirt. Even his jeans were wet with blood all around the waist, groin and hips, and his pant legs were streaked with blood right down to the cuffs. Worse yet, he looked at me with a crazed expression. His eyes widened with irrational rage and his teeth clenched and fully exposed. He looked like a 40-ish escaped con auditioning for the role of Carrie. The sight of this gore-soaked freak made me forget to breathe. He walked toward me with quick long strides that prompted me to click my mag light on and shine it at him. The light reflected brightly off his face, informing me that the blood on it was fresh. He was undaunted by the flashlight and maintained his course. "Sir," I said, "are you a guest at the motel?" He continued toward me. The closer he came, the clearer I could hear his manic breathing, which contained a growl with each exhalation. I felt it was obvious that he was going to attack. "Hey, I have pepper spray and I'm ready to use it," I said. His growling became more vocal and he seemed to hasten his step. At this point, he was about 20 feet away from me. A quick side note about the pepper spray. I bought that particular can because the label claimed it would fire a stream accurately up to 15 feet. The blood-covered man raised his gnarled, bloody hands towards me as though he intended to claw my face apart. I pressed the button on my pepper spray can, aiming high so as to hit his face. The stream was powerful and even had a bit of recoil that kicked my hand back. The beam from my mag light was also aimed at his face, so I could see the stream of liquid blast him directly in the eyes. It was so forceful that much of the blood in his face was instantly washed away. His eyes and mouth snapped shut a moment before he dropped and did a clumsy half pirouette away from me. I stopped spraying at him. He emitted a long, loud shriek of rage-laden anguish and raised his hands to his face. "I'm going to call the police," I said. I announced that in case he intended to resume his approach once his pain had subsided. "Don't think this is over," he growled. He turned and faced me with one eye partially open and a large cloud of mucus hanging from his nostrils. "You, sir, are a dead man," he hissed. He faced the exit of the parking lot and staggered toward it. I rushed into the lobby, locked the big glass doors, and called 911. They told me they'd send officers to make a report. The cops arrived minutes later. It's a fairly small town, and took my statement. They were particularly interested when I told them he was covered in blood. They said they might be in touch later on if somebody turned up injured or worse. But thankfully I never heard from them, and I think that's a good sign. I don't know if the blood on the whack job was the result of an injury he'd sustained or if he hurt somebody. And I couldn't say if he was legitimately insane or if he was out of his mind on hard drugs. All I know is that he was too out of sorts to wash or even wipe the blood from his face, so I shudder to imagine what he would have done if an occupied room had been accessible to him, or if he'd managed to get his big bloody hands on me. Yikes, I say. I'm a 20-year-old female, and 4 days a week I nanny a 4-year-old girl named Mia. Yesterday, Mia and I thought it would be fun to go get some lunch at 11 and, after, spend a few hours in this cute park that we call Castle Park, since the structure looks like a castle. Till it was time to go home for a nap. So at 11, I took her to a little cafe by the water. We live in a little coastal town, and when we finished, we headed across to the park. Mia's parents let her dress herself, and Since she's very excited about the new Cinderella movie, she wanted to wear her costume. Needless to say, when we got to Castle Park, she felt like a real princess. Usually when we go to the park, I'll play on the playground with her, but there were more children than usual there, so I stayed off and just sort of wandered around the play structure while keeping an eye on her. She shouted to me that she wanted me to watch her down the big slide. She had to go the complete other side of the structure, so I figured I had a minute to check the time. I walked over near the big slide and checked my phone. Her mom sent a text checking in, so I responded. But when I looked up, I didn't see Mia. I walked back towards where she was coming from but didn't see her. I walked back towards the slide and saw her about 20 yards outside of the structure area, talking to some guy on the grass. She had somehow gone across the structure, down the slide, and gotten past me in under 45 seconds. I ran over to where she was, and the man was squatted down in front of her. He looked like a completely normal guy, probably about 30 with dark hair. The only thing that struck me as creepy was he was holding the hem of her costume between his thumb and forefinger. "Oh, Cinderella," I said, and I swooped her up. But the guy didn't let go of her skirt and stood up with her as I lifted her up. I said, "Cinderella, are you talking to one of the townsfolk without your knight?" She laughed, and the guy laughed too. Mia then asked if she could see his puppy. Before I could say anything, the guy said, "He's just over there. We'll be right back." I backed up from him a few feet, forcing him to let go of Mia's costume. I said, "Well, Cinderella and I have to get back to our castle for our royal ball, but maybe another time." I started to walk away with Mia when the guy started to protest, saying how the puppy was so close and she loved him. I asked him if he wouldn't mind bringing the puppy over to Cinderella's castle, but he started to get really agitated and said the dog didn't have its shot, so it couldn't be out in the grass yet. I said sorry, but we couldn't stray too far from the castle, so I guess we wouldn't see the puppy, and we walked back to the structure with Mia. She was a little bummed out, but she's 4, so she forgot about the guy quickly. I let her go back on the structure, but after a few minutes, I saw the guy on the edge of the structure area looking at Mia. I called her down and walked her to the car, and the guy followed us. I buckled her in the car seat and grabbed my pepper spray from my purse. I turned around and the creep was about 15 feet from my car door. I held up the pepper spray and told the freaking weirdo that nobody wanted to see his non-existent dog, and if he didn't back up, I would scream. He looked really angry but just walked straight past my car and across the street and then out of sight. I took Mia home and told her mom everything when she got home. She called the sheriff and made a report. I probably should have shouted for help from somebody in the park, but in the moment I wasn't thinking straight. I just tried to be careful about not calling her Mia in front of him so he wouldn't know her name. I'm 34 and I've been camping my whole life. So when my sister asked me to take her boys for a long weekend in late September, I didn't even think twice about it. Robbie's 11 and Colt is 9. Good kids, both of them. Robbie is the quieter one, thoughtful and notices things. Colt is pure energy from the second he wakes up until he crashes hard at night. Neither of them had ever slept in a tent before, and they talked about it the entire 3-hour drive down to the park. I had a spot picked out at a state park in rural Tennessee. I'd been there 4 or 5 times over the years. Good trails, a creek nearby, and far enough from the main campground entrance that it stayed quiet. We set up Friday afternoon. The site was at the edge of the campground where the mowed grass ended and the tree line started. Dense woods behind us, an open field to the left, and 2 other occupied sites maybe 100 yards down the road. The boys helped me with the tent and we got a fire going before dark and cooked hot dogs on sticks, and Colt burned 3 of them and ate them anyway. It was exactly what a first camping trip should be. Friday night was completely fine. The other campers were a family with a dog and an older couple, and everybody was quiet by then. Boys fell asleep fast, and I sat by the fire for another hour just listening to the woods and the creek and then turned in. Saturday was a full day. We hiked a 4-mile loop in the morning and swam in the creek after lunch. Robbie caught a crawfish and carried it around in a cup for 2 hours before letting it go. By the time the sun went down, both boys were done. Colt was asleep before I even finished reading the first page of the book I'd brought. I sat outside by the fire and noticed the other campers were gone. Both sites down the road were empty. Cars gone and nothing left behind. I hadn't seen them pack up, but the timing made sense. Saturday night checkout. It was just us in that section now. It was around 10 when I looked up from my phone and saw somebody standing at the tree line. 20 yards back, just past where the firelight reached. A dark shape. Person-sized. Person-shaped. Completely still. I figured it was another camper cutting through or somebody who'd wandered from a different section of the park. I raised my hand and waved. Nothing. Didn't wave back and didn't move. Didn't really react at all, actually. I watched for a few minutes. The shape stayed exactly where it was. I told myself it was probably just a weird configuration of trees and shadow, and my eyes were playing tricks in the firelight. I let the fire burn lower and went into the tent and zipped it up and went to sleep. At 2 a.m, Robbie's hand was on my arm, shaking me. I opened my eyes and looked at him. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, and his face in the dark was doing something I'd never seen it do before. He wasn't crying. He wasn't making any sound at all, actually. He just looked at me with his eyes wide and pointed at the tent wall behind him. I looked. There was a shadow on the outside of the tent fabric. Definitely a person, standing inches from the tent, just on the other side of the material, right where the boys had been sleeping. The shadow was completely still, head, shoulders, and arms at the sides, just standing there in total silence, pressed almost against the tent wall. I put my hand over Robbie's mouth gently and shook my head. He nodded. I looked at Colt, still asleep somehow. I watched that shadow, and it watched me through the fabric, and neither of us moved for what felt like an extremely long time. Then it crouched, slowly, no sound at all, just folded downward until the shadow was at ground level, right where the boys' heads were, just crouching there. I grabbed the only thing I had with any weight to it, a metal flashlight I kept in the side pocket of my bag, and I unzipped the tent fast and got outside. But nothing there. I swept the flashlight in every direction. Trees, grass, the dead fire, and the empty campsites down the row. Completely empty. I stood there in the cold with my heart going and looked at the tree line and saw nothing. I got back in the tent and zipped it and told Robbie in a low voice that everything was fine. He didn't say anything. He just lay back down with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the tent. 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the grass, slow, coming from the left side of the tent. I tracked them with my eyes as they moved across the back end, then to the right, then stopped. I looked at the tent wall on the right side. Shadow again. Same shape and same stillness. I grabbed Robbie's arm and woke Colt up with my hand over his mouth before he could make noise. I whispered to both of them that we were going to the car right now and that they needed to stay completely quiet and stay right behind me. Robbie was already putting his shoes on. Colt's eyes were huge, but he nodded. I unzipped the tent and we went out the front fast, and I put both of the boys in front of me, and we moved towards the car, which was parked maybe 30 feet from the site. I had my keys already out. I was watching every direction. We got it. I locked the doors and started the engine and turned on the headlights. The beams cut straight across the campsite and the tree line behind it. He was standing at the tree line again. Same spot as earlier. Same total stillness. Fully lit up by the headlights now, and I could see him clearly for the first time. Just standing there with his arms at his sides looking at the car. I drove to the ranger station without stopping. The ranger on duty took it seriously and called the county sheriff. 2 deputies went out to the site while we sat at the station. They came back 40-ish minutes later and said they hadn't found anyone in the area. Said they'd do extra patrols through the night though. I didn't go back to the site. We slept in the station parking lot with the car running until the first light and drove home in the morning. Here is a part I keep thinking about and can't let go of. When I went back in the daylight to collect our gear, I found the campsite exactly as we left it in the dark. The tent is still up, chairs were still out, and the cooler is still by the fire pit. I broke everything down as fast as I could and loaded the car. Before I left, I walked the perimeter of the site just to look around at the light. On the far side of the tent, back near the tree line, I found something in the dirt. Footprints. Several of them were pressed deep, like somebody had been staying in the same spot for a long time. They faced the tent directly, but the prints weren't from the night before. The dirt around our site was soft from rain 2 days earlier, and prints on top of our own tracks from Friday and Saturday were older than that, pressed down harder, edges more settled. Whoever had been standing outside our tent that Saturday night had been standing in that exact same spot since before we ever arrived. He had been there watching that empty campsite and waiting before we even pulled in. I don't know what he was waiting for us to do, and I don't know what would have happened if Robbie hadn't woken me up. I don't know if he was still in those woods when I came back for the gear in the morning. Think about that last part maybe more than anything else. My sister has asked me twice since then to take the boys again next summer. I haven't given her an answer yet. So the other night around 2:30 a.m., I was at my house alone when I decided to take a break from playing guitar and have a smoke before bed. So I grabbed a smoke and started out my front door. About 3 or so minutes into my cigarette, I noticed this faint noise of what sounds like an old creaky metal object that needs to get oiled, but the sound has a cadence that makes it repeat every 2 or 3 seconds. After this happens for about 10 seconds, I notice that I can hear tires gripping the road as well. Then out of nowhere, I see a man who looks to be in his mid-40s probably. riding this horribly beaten down bike that emitted a very intense, ear-piercing, high-pitched squeak every time he pedaled. As I stood at my driveway and he passed me, he kept moving forward, but his head slowly rotated left and he locked eyes with me. I'm not kidding when I say that this guy looked identical to Hannibal Lecter from the movies, but that's not what made my heart drop. As I am locking eyes with him and he is moving past my driveway, he suddenly gives me the scariest, widest, creepiest jagged tooth smile I've ever seen in my life, and continues to lock eyes with me. And this wasn't an ordinary smile. I'm talking when the Grinch stole Christmas ear-to-ear smile. Within 15 more seconds, he continues pedaling and is out of sight. I can now just faintly hear his bicycle gears squeaking. At this point, I am wondering whether or not he is going around my rectangular block of a neighborhood and whether or not I can chief this sig fast enough to get inside before he comes around again. As I am doing this, I begin to hear the metal creak noise, but I also hear something different. I heard this dude laughing like a freaking maniac, which made me get the heck out of there. As I am stumbling for my door handle because of the adrenaline rush, he begins to round the turn where my door is almost in view. At the exact moment where I would have become visible, I got my door open, ran in, and slammed it shut and locked. No sooner does my door close than I hear the man from outside scream as loud as he can. "Where'd you go?" Laughing maniacally. At this point, I went into full-out battle mode, ran around my house and turned all the lights off. Battle crawled to my bedroom and waited. As I lay in my bed for the next 30 minutes, I would hear the squeaking of the bike for about 30 seconds or so every 3 to 4 minutes. About 30 to 45 minutes of this, it finally stopped and the man was gone. I have actually quit smoking since then and haven't been outside that late, but every now and then, around 2:30 a.m., I can still hear the squeaking of the bicycle from the outside of my room window. This happened when I was really young on a military base. All my life, I thought it was just a weird and terrifying and recurring dream until I mentioned it to my parents when I was a teenager, and they admitted it was completely real. They just didn't tell me all this time because they didn't think it would matter to know it's true. I was playing on a playground and my older sister was around nearby, but not playing with me. There was an officer's son by me though, and he started somewhat being nice. I remember him looking at me really close in the face and getting a big smile before he said, "You have really pretty eyes." Now, little me is super happy and says, "Thank you, that's very nice." Probably some vague compliment back. He was only a few years older than me by the looks of it, and neither of us were older than 10. He grabs a blunt stick that was lying next to us and pins me to the ground and starts trying to gouge my eyes out within seconds, and it's at that point I'm just stupidly staring at him, confused and worried. I'd never encountered violence like this in my life, and before I know it, the kid is holding my scrawny ass down and talking about how he's going to physically take my eyes away from it. It's then I start panicking because, can you even take your eyes off people? I was thinking. My sister shoves him off me and gets me to run with her away from him to our house. There wasn't anything we felt we could do when we told our parents because, again, it's the officer's son. When I'm a teen and this is all coming to light, they tell me they did talk to the officer. They told him what his son did was terrible and they didn't want it to happen again, but the dad was pretty entitled about it, and we just ended up not going out to play much anymore until that kid moved away. You've left many nightmares. I'm 31 and I was living in Novosibirsk for work when this happened. I know most people's first question is what I was doing in Siberia, and the short answer is pipeline infrastructure consulting. My company sent me out there for 8 months and I'd been there for about 5 of them when the storm hit. I'd experienced bad winters before, grew up in Minnesota, and thought I knew what cold actually meant. Novosibirsk set my understanding of that completely within my first 2 weeks. But even by those standards, the blizzard that came through in late January was something different. The city itself handled it fine. I mean, they're built for it. The infrastructure, the people, all of it. My issue was that I made the genuinely stupid decision to drive out to visit a colleague named Dmitry, who lived and worked from a property about 40 kilometers outside the city. We've been going over project documents together, and he invited me for dinner, and I figured 40 kilometers was nothing. I left his place around 9 at night. The snow had been coming down for a couple of hours, but the roads felt manageable, and I had a solid 4-wheel drive that the company had set me up with. Dmitry told me to stay, but I had an early call in the morning, and my own place felt more practical. 20 minutes into the drive, the weather shifted completely. The kind of shift that happens fast in open Siberian terrain, where there's nothing to slow down the wind for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I slowed to a crawl and then turned the heat up and gripped the wheel and told myself to just keep the road under me and I'd be fine. I lost the road somewhere in the next 10 minutes. I don't know exactly where or how. One moment I was on asphalt and the next the surface under my tires felt different, and I stopped and looked out and couldn't see anything in any direction, except white and dark and shapes of what I thought were trees somewhere off to my right. I tried to reverse and find the road again, got turned around instead and made it worse. I stopped the car completely and sat there and thought it through. Driving blind in a Siberian blizzard at night was how people died out here, and I knew it. I had heat, I had fuel, I had my phone. I called Dimitri first. The call connected but kept breaking up, and I got enough through to him that I thought he understood I was stuck somewhere off the road before the line dropped completely. I tried calling back at least 3 times and got nothing. I called the emergency number and got through to somebody who spoke limited English, and I spoke limited Russian. And between the two of us, I communicated that I was a foreign national stuck in a vehicle in the storm somewhere between the city and the coordinates I read off my phone's GPS. They said somebody would come. I had no real way of knowing if that was true or how long it would take. I settled in, kept the engine running for heat, cracked the window just slightly the way you're supposed to, and told myself this was going to be a long, uncomfortable night, but that I was going to be fine. I think about an hour in, I saw headlights. They were coming from somewhere off to my left, moving slowly through the white. I flashed my own lights and felt a wave of relief so strong it was almost physical. Somebody had found me. Search and rescue. Another driver. Dimitri himself. Whoever it was, I didn't care. The headlights stopped about 30 meters away and sat there. I waited for somebody to get out, flashed my lights again. The other vehicle's lights flashed back once. I got out of my car. The cold hit me like a wall, and I pulled my collar up and pushed through the wind toward the other vehicle. As I got closer, I could see it was an old truck, dark-colored, engine still running. The windows were fogged. I came around to the driver's side and knocked on the glass. The window came down. The man inside was older, probably 60, with a heavy coat and a fur hat and a face that had a lot of years in cold weather. He looked at me and said something in Russian I didn't catch. I told him in my limited Russian that I was lost, that I'd called for help, and that I was a foreigner. He nodded slowly like he understood at least some of it. He gestured for me to get in the passenger side. I hesitated slightly for a minute. The rational part of my brain ran through it fast. I was in a blizzard in Siberia in the dark with temperatures dropping and a rescue team that may or may not have understood where I was. Getting into a warm vehicle with another person was the logical thing to do. I got in. He drove without saying much. I tried a few more broken phrases of Russian and he responded in short sentences I mostly couldn't follow. I showed him my phone with the map and pointed toward the city, and he nodded and kept driving. After about 15 minutes, I started to feel uneasy. I wasn't sure of much in terms of direction given the conditions, but something about the way we were moving felt wrong. The city should have been roughly northeast of where I'd been stuck. The way the limited visibility shifted around us and the angle of the wind against the windshield felt like we were heading in a different direction entirely. I showed him the phone again and pointed at the city marker. He glanced at it and said something and kept driving. I asked him where we were going in the clearest Russian I could manage. He said a word I didn't know and kept his eyes in the dark ahead of us. The trees were thicker now. We were going deeper into something rather than out of it. I looked at my phone, and the GPS showed us moving steadily away from Novosibirsk. I told him to stop. He used the word I knew, stop, and said it clearly. But he didn't. I said it again a little bit louder and put my hand on the dashboard. He looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time since I'd gotten it. His expression was completely unreadable. He said something slow and quiet that I didn't understand a single word of, and then looked back at the road. My hand went to the door handle. He saw it. His hand came off the gear shift. I pulled the handle and shoved the door open while the truck was still moving and got out, hit the ground hard and rolled up and came in knee-deep snow and just ran. Behind me, I heard the truck slow and stop. I even heard the driver's door open. I ran into the trees and kept running and didn't look back. The cold was ferocious and the snow was everywhere, and I had no idea where I was going, but I ran until I couldn't hear anything behind me over the wind. I found a road about 10 minutes later, collapsed onto it, and just lay there for a moment breathing. A rescue vehicle found me probably an hour after that. 2 men from the emergency services who had been following the GPS coordinates I'd given and had tracked down the movement off my phone. They pulled me aside and wrapped me up, and one of them spoke decent English, and I told him everything while we drove back towards the city. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that 2 years before, a foreign contractor had gone missing during a winter storm on the same stretch of road between Novosobirsk and the outlying properties. Never found. The investigation had gone cold fast. He didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't ask him to. I flew home 6 weeks later when my contract ended. Told my company I wasn't available for renewal. I thought about that truck a lot since then, and about the moment his came off the gear shift when he saw me reach for the door. I got lucky that phone had signal long enough for them to track me. I got lucky the door opened, and lucky the snow was deep enough to land in without breaking anything. Most of all, I got lucky. I listened to something in my gut that told me to move before my brain had finished working out all the reasons why. I don't know who that man was, and I don't know where he was taking me. I don't know if the contractor who disappeared 2 years before ever got into a truck in a blizzard thinking somebody was there to help them. I just know I got out and they did it. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. So I have a couple of stories I've wanted to share here, but a friend reminded me of this one tonight, and I figured it would fit perfectly here. This happened in 1999, and though I am from the state of Virginia, this happened many miles away from my hometown and was out close to the mountains in central Virginia. My friend, whom I will call Tay, and I had gone on a little road trip to see some caverns. At 19, it was the first time either of our parents had let us drive so far from home by ourselves. It was also still a little earlier than Google Maps, Siri, or Alexa, so we were relying on old school maps. There had been a few rest areas marked on the map that we'd already missed, and Tay really had to pee. Finally, we spotted the welcome site of Rest Area 2 miles sign. As we pulled in, it was around 10 p.m. and there were a few cars in the parking lot. We hopped out of the van and headed in to take care of our business and get some sodas and snacks from the vending machines, as we still had another 25 minutes of riding before the town we were going to get a hotel room for the night in. As we were being indecisive at the vending machines, we soon noticed the cars and people we'd seen around had all left. There were a few tractor trailers humming off to the side from what we remember, but they were far enough off to the side of the back parking lot they'd have never heard us scream if we had to. Then we see an older navy blue Chevy come sliding in through the entrance. At first, it's a semi-relief, but as Tay's waiting for her soda to drop, I am watching the truck. It parks right up next to our van, ignoring 45 other parking spaces. I still downplay that to somebody thinking safety in numbers or something, even though back then, women often tried not to park next to vans in dark parking lots. But this truck had pulled up on the passenger side of our van, and as we were walking towards the van, they still hadn't gotten out. Tay says something along the lines of, "What are they up to?" And she was the one driving, so it was I who had to go squeeze between the Chevy truck and my passenger side van door. They hadn't left a lot of room. I almost told Tay I'm not going to do it as I rounded the back of the van and squeezed through quickly, jumping up and slamming my door as if they'd grab me. Just as we lock our doors and I turn to put my seatbelt on, there is a man who has hopped out of this Chevy and is standing in the little space knocking in my rolled up window. I let out a squeal and literally locked the door in his face. He reminded me of that comedian Gallagher who used to smash watermelons, only he was wearing a dirty baseball hat. He says something along the lines of, "Sorry to scare you," and starts rambling on. Tay cracks my window a bit so we can hear, and he says, "I'm lost. We're not from here." I say, "So we couldn't help much. Do you know if we're already past Petersburg?" he asked, ignoring my original cop-out answer. Tay and I kind of glance at each other because Petersburg is at least 80 or more miles in another direction, so I say, "I don't know, sir. Again, we're not from here." "Good luck, though there is a large map inside that may help." Again ignoring me, he suddenly reaches up and slides his fingers in the crack in my window and starts yanking as if he's trying to break the glass. In fact, I don't know how it didn't give. As Tay starts wrestling with getting her keys from her lap to the ignition, we're both panicking and yelling stop. And suddenly, he does just as Tay is turning over the ignition. And he says in a very low, growly voice, "I've drunk blood fresher than yours anyway," and gives one more good yank as Tay's backing out of the parking space with his fingers still in the window, as I am simultaneously trying to roll up my window. He did not follow us out as we fled back towards the interstate, and we didn't inform the police or our parents because we didn't want to hear any stranger danger I told you so's. So I'm a waitress at a pretty small village pub. It's really chill, and we don't get a lot of customers, so I'm usually the only server or bartender. The only really busy day is Sunday around noon, so my boss stays to help me with the lunch rush. Last Sunday was pretty calm and manageable. I was taking care of the customers in the main room and garden, while my boss was taking care of 2 large parties in a separate dining hall. Since it's a small village pub in a very rural area, I know almost all of our customers. So that one guy really stood out because I had never seen him before. He was probably in his 40s, smelled horrible, and had extremely greasy hair. He was just standing at the bar, drinking beer and talking to a man who is a regular and comes in every day. The weird guy was constantly staring at me with wide eyes, biting his nails, which was already creepy as heck. I overheard him saying stuff like, "Wow, she is such a doll, unbelievable," or "I wish she would wear a miniskirt to work," to the other customer. That made me obviously uncomfortable, but still it happens every day since I'm an 18-year-old girl and most of my customers are 40-plus-year-old men. About an hour later, my area was pretty empty, and the creepy guy was the only one left at the bar. He was still staring at me and biting his nails. My boss was standing at the other end of the bar with one of the customers, who was paying a pretty large bill, and when the customer opened his wallet, you could see a bunch of 100-pound notes in there. The creepy guy mumbled something in my direction, and I said, I'm sorry, what was that?" He was waving me to get closer, so I did, and he mumbled very quietly, "Hey, I have a great idea." I said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" He nodded towards the customer paying his bill and mumbled, "We could kill this guy, bury his body in the woods, take all his money and run off together." I thought that was some kind of odd joke and awkwardly tried to laugh, but the guy didn't laugh or smile or anything. I just kind of stuttered. "Sorry, I don't think that's a good idea." He still wasn't smiling or laughing, so I just snoped the heck out of there and started to do some work in the back until the guy was gone. I'm used to creeps, but that was some next level stuff, and I still don't know if he was trying to make a joke or if he actually meant it. I'm 22, and that trip was supposed to be the best week of my life. I and my 2 best friends, Connor and Soren, had been planning it since the previous winter. 7 days in Maui. The first real vacation any of us had taken together as adults. We saved for it for months. Booked a small rental house about 10 minutes from Anapali. Cheap enough that we could still afford to actually do things while we were there. The first 3 days were perfect. Beach every morning, food everywhere. Cliff jumping at spots Soren found on forums, staying up too late on the back porch with cheap beer. Kind of trip you spend the whole flight home already missing. On the 4th day, we rented a car and drove the road to Hana. If you don't know it, it's a 2-lane highway that winds along the northeastern coast of Maui through rainforest and sea cliffs. 60-something miles over 50 bridges, hundreds of turns. The views are unreal. It's also genuinely remote in stretches. No cell service for long sections, for me at least. No gas stations, no houses. Just jungle on one side and ocean dropping away on the other. We started early and took our time stopping at waterfalls and black sand beaches along the way. By mid-afternoon, we were deep in the back end of the road, past Hana town itself, and the section most tourists turn around before reaching. The road gets rougher back there, narrower, and the jungle presses in closer on both sides. We stopped at a trailhead that wasn't marked on any of our map, just a gap in the vegetation with a worn dirt path leading into the trees. Soren wanted to see where it went. Connor was already out of the car. I followed because that's what you do. The trail dropped downward fast, switching back through dense growth, the kind of thick layered jungle where the canopy closes above you and the light goes green and strange. We could hear water somewhere below. After about 15 minutes of descending, we came out on a small black rock shelf above a cove. The water below was deep blue and completely enclosed by rock walls on 3 sides, completely hidden from above and from the road. The only way in or out was the trail we'd come down or the ocean. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, and it was completely empty. We stayed for maybe an hour, swam in the cove, ate the snacks we'd brought, and took photos. At some point, I climbed up onto a higher shelf of rock to get a better angle for the picture and looked down into the water. There was something on the bottom of the cove. Dark shapes. Several of them were spread out across the rock floor of the cove, maybe 15 feet below the surface. I stared for a long time trying to work out what I was looking at. The water was clear enough that I could see the shapes, but the depth and the angle made it hard to define them. I called Connor over and pointed. He looked for a long time without saying anything. Then he said they looked like bags, like large duffel bags weighted down with something and placed on the bottom. There were 6 of them arranged in a loose cluster, not washed in by current, placed. The way they sat on the bottom was too deliberate, too grouped to be accidental. None of us said anything for a moment. Soren was already back in the water before we could say anything, and I grabbed his arm and pulled him out and told him what we were looking at. He went back to the edge and looked and his face changed. We left, fast back up the trail without discussing it, nobody saying much. When we got back to the car, Connor tried his phone and found a single bar of service and called 911. The dispatcher had trouble understanding our exact location because we didn't have a name for the trail of the cove and our GPS coordinates kept dropping. She told us to drive toward Hanatown, where service was better, and stay on the line. We drove and gave them everything we could: the rough distance from Hana, the unmarked trailhead, the description of the cove, and what we saw at the bottom. 2 officers met us in Hanatown a little while later. They took detailed statements, and one of them knew the cove we were describing. Knew it by a local name I can't remember now. He didn't say much when we described the bags, but the way he looked at his partner said enough. We drove back to the rental house and sat on the back porch and didn't really talk for a long time. We found out through a local news alert 3 days later, our last day on the island, that a dive team had recovered items from a cove on the eastern coast, consistent with an ongoing investigation. But not many details beyond that. No follow-up that we ever found either. I've looked for more information since we got home and found nothing. But I think about that cove often, how hidden it was. How you'd only find it if you were looking for that specific unmarked trail or if you already knew it was there. How we almost swam right over whatever was down there, got back in the car and drove home and never thought twice about it. I think about who else knew that cove was there, and whether they saw a rental car parked at that trailhead on their way past.